It's the 10th anniversary of Disney's live-action Cinderella, and I thought this is the perfect time to make the gift that Ella's father brings her after a trip. The butterfly in a flower in a box. You first see this in the movie when her dad gives her the present, and then you can see it again in the box where she hides her glass slipper. I also found a deleted scene where the stepmother's trying to sell all of Ella's father's things, and Ella goes and ends up getting it back. And then this is what my version kind of ends up looking like. The outside does not look exactly the same, but I did what I could with what I had. I only gave myself 3 days to work on this project. Hopefully this has enough information on how I sort of put this together that if you want to try to make one, you could do a better version than I did. I had this thin piece of wood that I thought was a decent size for the base. I cut a piece of cardboard to the width of one edge, then I sliced the liner board along the fluted sections to make the board bendable. After that, I cut it to the shape I wanted and repeated that process 4 times. Now that the cardboard is flexible, I have to make it hold its new shape. I found this recipe for paper mache clay, which I linked in the description. So I mixed that up and plastered it onto the cardboard while it was weighed down by a glass cup. I could have done each section individually, but I was running short on time and I had to leave enough time for everything to dry. Once that had dried, I gave it all a coat of drywall joint compound. Then when that was dry, I wiped it smooth with a wet rag. This was another thing that, in hindsight, maybe I could have found an actual box that was already this shape, but I had decided just to try it this way. Painted it black, let that dry, painted it teal, let that dry, and then a lighter teal, and let that dry. Then I used that same color to paint some doilies to use later. After that, I used a paper I had to cut out a paper lining, just kind of taped and glued it in there. Like I said, I had not used hinges, which if I had, I probably still would have taped and glued this in here. As far as the closure goes, I started to try to use magnets, but that didn't work at all. Then I sewed a string through the inside of the top of it to loop around, which mostly worked, except what I looped it to didn't end up staying, and later I changed it. And in the end, I ended up just using some earrings, so they had a hook on the back and that kind of held them in place. After that was attached, I covered them up with the doily pieces. Okay, on to part 2. This is making the flower. So I didn't have any pink paper that was the color I wanted, and just went ahead and colored the whole thing with watercolor paint. After that was dry, I used the paper to fold it into a petal shape. The main trick to this petal is having one side being creased going one way and the other being creased the opposite direction, sort of we make sort of a W shape out of that side. And that's really all there is to it. So I needed 8 of the larger petals and then 4 of a smaller size. Out of the 8 larger petals, 2 of them stack inside of each other. Then this is a slightly different fold for the smaller petals. I just basically turned them in a little bit closer towards the top, and I really just eyeballed all of these. I didn't have like a template or anything I was exactly going off of. In addition to that, I needed 4 green petal shapes. I added that to the stack of the 3 and then stapled them together, making sure to leave the green part open so I could use that to cover the staple. At this point, I didn't really know how I was going to attach it all, but I decided to staple the sets of petals in 2 and then glued those together in the middle. That didn't end up being strong enough, but you'll see how I fix that later. After that, I glued the thinner petals in between each of those, then tested it to make sure it all fit. If you want your butterfly to fit, you're gonna have to make your petals a little bit smaller than what I did. Now it's just trying to figure out how to attach it to the bottom of the box. And the best thing I came up with was sewing it to a piece of cardstock, but as you can see, I'm just kind of going in and out, and I tried to kind of use the petals to cover up parts of the thread. In the end, once that was all sewn together and hot glued, I think it worked. Now the box from the movie, you can tell they use some type of punch for their flowers because they're so uniform, but I did not have such a punch, so I just kind of cut mine out like a snowflake. They were definitely not super uniform, but you know what? It kind of looks like a flower to me. Now I'm just moving some of the pieces around to make it look more alive and like a real flower. All right, now for the last piece, which is putting together the butterfly. Here's a regular piece of origami paper compared to the paper that I used. I ended up doubling it in size. It took me a long time to find this butterfly pattern, but the one I found I've linked in the description if you want to see the original. It's easier to follow along because it goes slower and you can fold it as you watch. You don't have to like pause and whatnot. But there are a few things that I did change to make it look more like the one from the movie. I'm just barely tucking this in here to give it a little more of the shape I want. And later when the whole thing is made, I end up re-tightening some of those sections and curling some of the wings so it looks more like a three-dimensional thing. So if you're following along right now, do not follow this section here, but this is what I did. I'm really happy with how this butterfly turned out. And on to painting the butterfly. Now, the paper I used was not regular paper, and the way that the paint stuck onto this was kind of weird. It was almost like a waxy paper, so I ended up going over this a few times with the paint. I just kind of looked at the picture and tried to base it off of it. Drew the veins on. I outlined the edges only on the parts where you could see the actual edge of the paper, not where it was a fold. Not in the video, I put a paper clip inside of the back to give it some stability, keep it closed like that, and then I also ended up putting a wire in, which I don't know why I did not get that on video, but I did put a wire in it. And there's the whole thing all together. So after carefully closing this thing up, which was actually a lot more difficult than I was expecting, again, maybe I should have made the petals a little bit smaller. The unthinkable happened. Okay, that should have been expected, really. It was held in with hot glue and I was pulling on it. Like, what was I thinking was gonna happen? Anyway, this is when I ended up adding the earrings because they had a back and they just hooked right in. I ended up painting this tassel and the earrings gold. This doesn't look exactly like the box outside, but it does have some gold details on the top, so this is just what I had. And here is the final look. I'm super happy with how it turned out. I actually made this as a gift for Bella May Designs. She had a Cinderella anniversary watching party, and so I got to give it to her at the party, which was super fun. So there it is. That's the final look. Thanks for watching.